Story 1. The Nash Trap. Law. You cooperate even when betrayal is rational. The experiment was simple. In 1950, at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, mathematician John Nash formalized a problem that military planners already feared. 2 players. Limited information. A choice, cooperate or defect. The math said betrayal often paid better. Humans didn't follow the math. They cooperated. Not once. Repeatedly. Even when betrayal was safer. Even when betrayal was rewarded. The numbers didn't match behavior. Something else was operating. The model became known as the prisoner's dilemma. On paper, the rational move is defection. In reality, most people choose cooperation, especially when they believe the game might repeat. Future punishment outweighs present gain. Fear changes equation. Researchers recorded it. Over decades. Across cultures. In controlled labs and real-world simulations. When participants believed there would be another round, they complied. They stayed loyal. They accepted smaller rewards to avoid retaliation later. The data was consistent. The future disciplined the present. Punishment didn't need to arrive. What happened next is rarely discussed. By the early 1960s, versions of this model migrated out of academia. First into nuclear deterrence planning, then into labor policy. Corporations realized something critical. You didn't need to threaten workers directly. You just needed to make consequences ambiguous and long-term. Human resources departments began mirroring the structure. Annual reviews, promotion tracks, reputation scores. One misstep wouldn't end a career, but it might poison future rounds. Employees learn quickly. Don't defect. Don't speak first. Don't break cooperation, even when the system breaks you. Defection became expensive. Silence became rational. The suppression wasn't violent. It was procedural. Non-disclosure agreements. Performance improvement plans. Cultural fit evaluations. No single punishment looked severe enough to resist. But together, they formed a deterrence grid. Nash's equilibrium wasn't enforced by guards. It was enforced by memory. The consequences were human. People stayed in hostile environments because leaving meant losing accumulated trust. Whistleblowers hesitated because the next job interview was another round of the same game. One engineer interviewed years later admitted he stayed quiet about safety violations. He missed his daughter's graduation. Not because he was ordered to, because defection risked future employability. The model predicted that outcome. The math didn't need consent. It only needed repetition. By the time critics noticed, the structure was already normalized. Cooperation was reframed as loyalty. Defection as toxicity. The game disappeared into policy language. But the incentives remained intact. This wasn't psychology as advice. It was strategy as infrastructure. And by 1962, this model entered federal labor policy. Story 2. Loss aversion dominance. Law. Losses outweigh gains by a factor 2. The discovery didn't come from a battlefield. It came from a lab. In 1979, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky ran a series of decision-making experiments that produced a quiet but dangerous result. When people faced a choice, they did not calculate outcomes evenly. They feared losses far more than they valued gains. The imbalance was measurable. Losing $100 hurt roughly twice as much as gaining $100 felt good. The pain was asymmetric. Fear distorted choice. They called it loss aversion. It violated classical economic theory. Rational actors were supposed to optimize for maximum gain. Instead, subjects consistently chose options that avoided loss, even when those options led to worse long-term outcomes. The data held. Across age groups. Across cultures. Repeated trials showed the same pattern. Faced with guaranteed small loss or a risky option that might avoid loss entirely, most people chose the risk, even when the math said not to. Avoid the loss. Ignore the future. What made the finding dangerous was its predictability. If fear of loss dominated decision-making, behavior could be steered without force. You didn't have to offer rewards. You only had to threaten removal. By the mid-1980s, insurance companies were the first to operationalize it. Policies weren't sold on protection. They were sold on fear. What you could lose. Your house. Your health. Your family stability. The language was precise. The results were immediate. Then advertisers followed. Internal marketing documents from the late 1980s show identical framing across industries. Don't miss out. Last chance. Offer expires. The product mattered less than the implied loss of not acting. Urgency replaced value. Fear replaced need. One internal framework, referenced repeatedly in corporate strategy decks, appeared under a neutral label, Protocol L3B. Its function was simple. Frame every decision as a potential loss. Track compliance rates. Adjust messaging until resistance collapsed. The suppression here wasn't censorship. It was emotional. People didn't realize they were being steered because the fear felt internal, personal, rational. The consequences were not abstract. A middle manager in Chicago stayed in a job he described as slowly corrosive for 11 years. Each year he planned to leave. Each year the calculation was the same. Leaving meant losing seniority, health coverage, and perceived stability. Staying meant tolerable misery. He developed stress-related heart issues at 42. He told interviewers later, "I couldn't afford to lose what I already had." That sentence appears, almost verbatim, in loss aversion studies. By the 1990s, the law had moved beyond commerce. Health messaging, retirement planning, political campaigns. The same structure, the same framing. Avoid loss at all costs, even if the cost is long-term damage. Loss aversion didn't eliminate choice. It narrowed it, until the safe option was the only one visible. By 1987, 3 major advertising agencies had formally adopted this model. Story 3, the status quo lock. Law, default options control outcomes. The data came from an administrative mistake. In the late 1980s, European health ministries noticed something strange about organ donation rates. Neighboring countries, similar cultures, similar education levels, radically different outcomes. In opt-in countries, donation rates hovered below 20%. In opt-out countries, they exceeded 90%. Nothing else changed. No campaigns. No moral appeals. just a checkbox. Researchers traced the cause to a single variable, the default setting. In opt-in systems, citizens had to actively choose to donate. In opt-out systems, donation was automatic unless refused. Most people did nothing, and doing nothing decided everything. The conclusion was unsettling. People weren't making choices. They were accepting preloaded outcomes. Inaction looked like freedom. It wasn't. Behavioral economists replicated the effect in controlled environments. Retirement savings, software permissions, privacy settings. When a default was present, resistance dropped sharply. Even when alternatives were clearly explained, even when the stakes were high, the human brain treated defaults as recommendations, or warnings, or signals of authority. Changing them felt risky, unnecessary, or socially deviant. Why change it? Someone smarter already decided. By the early 1990s, institutions noticed. Defaults weren't just convenient. They were decisive. Governments quietly rewrote forms. Corporations pre-selected options. Digital platforms buried alternatives behind extra steps. Each additional click reduced affection. Internal policy documents from that period show the same phrase appearing alongside loss aversion frameworks, Protocol L3B. Here, it was expanded. Loss framing determined fear. Defaults determined direction. Together, they formed a closed loop. The suppression was subtle. There were no bans. No force. Choice technically remained. But effort became the gatekeeper. Those who wanted out had to work harder than those who complied. Friction enforced obedience. Silence did the rest. The consequences surfaced slowly. A public school teacher in Oregon described enrolling automatically into a supplemental retirement plan she never wanted. The deductions were small. The paperwork to exit was complex. She postponed it for years. When she finally noticed the total, it had altered her monthly budget permanently. She postponed medical treatment twice to compensate. She blamed herself. That was the design. Status quo bias reframed inertia as personal failure. If you didn't act, the system assumed consent. If the outcome harmed you, it was because you chose not to intervene. By the mid-1990s, default logic moved beyond policy and into software. Privacy erosion followed the same script. Data sharing pre-approved. Opt-outs buried. Warnings framed as inconvenience. Compliance without awareness. Control without fingerprints. What made the law durable was its deniability. No enforced agreement. They only set the starting position. Every outcome could be defended as voluntary. By 1994, default architectures were measurably determining national behavior. If these first three were coincidences, the next law will test that theory. Story 4. The Zero-Sum Illusion. Law. You are trained to believe scarcity where none exists. The study was conducted in a controlled environment, but the reaction was instinctive. In the early 1970s, social psychologists divided participants into two groups and gave them a task with unlimited rewards. Cooperation increased total gain for everyone. Competition reduced it. Most participants still competed, not because they had to, because they believed someone else's gain meant their loss. Scarcity was assumed. Conflict followed. This belief, known as zero-sum thinking, did not emerge naturally. It intensified under specific conditions: time pressure, ranking systems, and comparative feedback. The moment participants were told who was ahead, cooperation collapsed. People withheld information, sabotaged progress, accepted worse outcomes to prevent others from advancing. The data was clear. When status is framed as limited, humans defend position over progress. Better to block, worse to share. Military psychologists noticed immediately. Zero-sum framing simplified decision-making in high-stress environments. It turned complex systems into enemies and allies. During the Cold War, this logic became foundational in psychological operations manuals. If a population believed resources were scarce, internal conflict would do the work of control. By the 1980s, the same framing appeared in civilian life. Corporate ladders, performance rankings, forced distributions. Only a fixed percentage could succeed. The math was artificial. The behavior was real. Someone had to lose. So everyone fought. Internal training materials from several Fortune 500 firms show explicit use of scarcity language. Limited slots, top percentile, winner take most. The goal wasn't efficiency. It was compliance. Competing employees were easier to manage than unified ones. The suppression method was narrative. Cooperation was reframed as weakness. Collective bargaining became unprofessional. Helping a peer threatened your own evaluation. The system didn't forbid solidarity. It punished it indirectly. A product designer in San Jose described refusing to share a process improvement that would have saved his team months. He knew it would help everyone, but it would also erase his individual advantage. He got the promotion. 2 years later, the team was dissolved. He was laid off with them. Winning didn't protect him. It only delayed loss. Zero-sum illusion created enemies where none were required. It converted abundance into anxiety. People began guarding opportunities that could not be stolen, only shared. The long-term consequence was isolation, burnout, distrust. Systems optimized for rivalry stagnated faster, but the individuals inside blamed themselves for not winning harder. By the time research challenged zero-sum assumptions, the framing was already embedded. Rankings felt natural. Scarcity felt inevitable. Questioning it sounded naive, but the illusion served its purpose. Divided players never questioned the board. By the late 1980s, zero-sum framing was codified in 3 military psychological operations manuals. Story 5, The Rational Actor Myth. Law: humans do not optimize. They satisfice. For decades, economic systems were built on a single assumption that humans behave rationally. That given enough information, people weigh options, calculate outcomes, and choose what benefits them most. The evidence contradicted it almost immediately. In the 1950s, Nobel laureate Herbert Simon observed a pattern that classical models ignored. When faced with complex decisions, people did not seek the best possible option. They sought the first option that felt good enough. He called it satisficing. Optimization required effort. Effort was avoided. The finding was replicated relentlessly. Voters choosing candidates. consumers choosing insurance plans, patients choosing treatments. When options exceeded a narrow threshold, decision quality declined. More information didn't help. It overwhelmed. Participants defaulted to shortcuts, familiar brands, trusted authorities, simple narratives. They stopped searching long before reaching optimal outcomes. Good enough felt safe. Safe felt rational. This created a problem for institutions. If humans didn't optimize, then freedom of choice didn't produce better decisions. It produced predictable ones. And predictability could be engineered. By the 1970s, policymakers and corporations quietly adjusted. Instead of offering better options, they offered fewer. Or framed one as obviously acceptable. Choice architecture replaced persuasion. You didn't have to convince people. You only had to exhaust them. The suppression here was cognitive. Complexity became a tool. Forms grew longer. Contracts denser. Options multiplied just enough to paralyze resistance. The moment a person felt tired, they complied. A hospital administrator described watching patients sign consent forms they didn't read. Not because they didn't care. Because they couldn't process one more variable. One patient later said, "I just wanted it to be over." She signed away the right to appeal coverage denial. The humane loss was quiet. People blamed themselves for bad outcomes, for not researching more, for not being smarter. The system framed failure as personal inadequacy, not structural design. Confusion looked like freedom. It wasn't. One could argue these biases disappear with education, but longitudinal data shows otherwise. Even experts satisfice under pressure. Even trained professionals rely on heuristics when stakes are high and time is limited. By the early 2000s, the rational actor model was formally abandoned in behavioral economics, but it remained embedded in public rhetoric. People were still told they were choosing freely, even as systems were tuned for predictable shortcuts. The myth persisted because it was useful. If outcomes were bad, responsibility could be reassigned to the individual. You chose this. You signed that. You decided. The game didn't need perfect players. It only needed tired ones. By 2002, the rational actor model was officially rejected in modern economic theory. Story 6. Signaling over substance. Law. In repeated games. Appearances outperform reality. The pattern emerged in biology before economics ever noticed it. In the 1970s, evolutionary theorists studying animal behavior identified a strange rule. Certain traits survived not because they were useful, but because they were expensive. A peacock's tail. A stag's antlers. They were signals. Costly, inefficient, and impossible to fake. Their very waste proved fitness. Waste became evidence. Efficiency was irrelevant. Economists adapted the concept into signaling theory. In markets where quality is hard to verify, signals replace substance. Degrees, signal intelligence. Luxury brands signal status. Long work hours signal commitment, regardless of output. In one controlled study, 2 groups were evaluated for competence. One produced better results. The other displayed stronger signals, confidence, credentials, Visibility. When evaluators had limited time, the signaling group won promotions at nearly double the rate. Perception beat performance. Every time, the rule intensified in repeated games, where reputation mattered more than results. Once a signal was established, it carried forward. Failures were forgiven. Absence was punished. Being seen mattered more than being right. By the late 2000s, digital platforms amplified the effect. Metrics replaced merit. Followers, engagement, activity indicators. Visibility became quantifiable. Substance became optional. Internal platform research showed the same conclusion across departments. Users who signaled consistently were rewarded by algorithms, even when their underlying contribution declined. The system couldn't see depth. It could only see noise. The suppression method was structural. Those who focused on quiet competence disappeared from rankings. Those who performed visibility thrived. Over time, people adapted. Work shifted from creation to presentation. A software engineer described staying late every night, not to improve code, but to ensure his status indicator remained active. He was praised for dedication. His actual output fell. He missed his son's first school play. The humane loss was time, not stolen openly, exchanged for the illusion of value. By 2010, signaling logic was embedded into algorithmic reward systems. Engagement outweighed accuracy. Consistency outweighed quality. The game no longer asked what you did. It asked how it looked. Those who refused the signal weren't punished directly. They were simply ignored. Promotion stalled. Visibility vanished. The absence of feedback did the work of discipline. From the outside, it appeared meritocratic. From the inside, it was theatrical. The rule was now automated. By 2010, algorithms rewarded signals almost exclusively. Story 7, The Winner's Curse. Law. Winning often means you overpaid. The warning came from auctions. In the 1960s, economists analyzing competitive bidding noticed a paradox. The participant who won most often was also the one most likely to regret it. When information was incomplete, the highest bidder routinely paid more than the asset was worth. They called it the winner's curse. Victory concealed error. Success carried a penalty. The effect intensified under pressure. The more public the competition, the more aggressive the bids. Ego entered the equation. So did fear. Losing felt visible. Winning felt necessary. Rational limits dissolved. Data from oil lease auctions, corporate takeovers, and government contracts showed the same pattern. The winning bid exceeded realistic value by a predictable margin. The margin wasn't accidental. It was psychological. Better to win badly than lose publicly. As the model spread, its implications grew darker. Promotions, academic tenure, romantic pursuits. Any environment with scarce prizes and competitive signaling became vulnerable. The moment success was framed as exclusive, people overcommit. By the 1990s, corporate mergers provided textbook examples. Acquiring firms paid premiums far above synergies. Share prices spiked briefly, then declined. Executives kept their reputations. Employees absorbed the damage. The trophy was temporary. The debt was permanent. The suppression method was celebration. Wins were praised immediately. Costs were deferred. By the time consequences surfaced, the decision-maker had often moved on. Accountability dissolved across time. A regional bank executive described pushing aggressively for a promotion that required relocation and longer hours. He won the role over dozens of candidates. Within 18 months, his workload doubled, his autonomy vanished, and his health declined. He developed hypertension at 39. He told a colleague later, "If I'd lost, my life would be better." That realization is common in winner's curse cases. The act of winning blinds participants to the true price until it is already paid. Success masked extraction. Applause at the cost. Systems learn to exploit this. If competition was framed intensely enough, individuals would volunteer for unfavorable outcomes, longer hours, lower security, higher stress, just to secure the win. The system didn't have to coerce. Ambition did the work. By the time doubts appeared, identity was already invested. Quitting felt like failure. Endurance replaced evaluation. The curse persisted because it felt personal. You chose to compete. You chose to win. The system only provided the arena. But the arena was designed so that someone always overpaid. By the late 1990s, the winner's curse was documented in over 70% of hostile corporate takeovers. Story 8, The Coordination Trap. Law. Everyone waits for everyone else. The failure was never about courage. It was about timing. In 1968, economists formalized what activists and whistleblowers already sensed. In many systems, acting alone is punished, but acting together is rewarded. The problem is that no one knows when together begins. So no one moves. They called it a coordination game. Everyone agrees. No one acts. In these models, every participant prefers change, but only if others change at the same time. If you move first and others don't follow, you absorb all the cost. Reputation loss, retaliation, isolation. The rational strategy becomes waiting. Indefinitely, the first mover bleeds. The second survives. Labor strikes demonstrated it clearly. Individually, workers wanted reform. Collectively, they fear being singled out. The same math applied to whistleblowing, social reform, even speaking up in meetings. Silence became the dominant strategy, not because people approved, but because they calculated risk. By the 1990s, internal corporate research showed something alarming. When fear of retaliation was high and coordination uncertain, dissent collapsed to near zero, even when dissatisfaction exceeded 80%. Labor strikes demonstrated it clearly. Individually, workers wanted reform. Collectively, they fear being singled out. The same math applied to whistleblowing, social reform, even speaking up in meetings. Silence became the dominant strategy, not because people approved, but because they calculated risk. By the 1990s, internal corporate research showed something alarming. When fear of retaliation was high and coordination uncertain, Dissent collapsed to near zero, even when dissatisfaction exceeded 80%. Consensus existed. Action didn't. This is where Protocol L3B resurfaced, not as marketing, but as containment. Internal documents framed dissent as a coordination failure problem. The solution was simple: isolate potential first movers. Fragment communication. Increase uncertainty about allies. The suppression method wasn't censorship. It was ambiguity. People never knew who else felt the same way. Meetings were private. Feedback was siloed. Complaints were individualized. You felt alone. You weren't. A compliance analyst at a financial firm uncovered a reporting flaw that exposed clients to risk. He assumed others had seen it. He waited. Weeks passed. No one spoke. When he finally raised the issue, management responded calmly and reassigned him. No one defended him. He later learned 3 colleagues had flagged the same issue independently. None knew about the others. He stopped trusting group action entirely. That loss was psychological. Faith in collective protection dissolved. Each person retreated into private calculation. The system stabilized, not because it worked, but because coordination never formed. By the 2010s, digital platforms amplified the trap. Algorithms personalized feeds. Fragmenting shared awareness. Outrage appeared widespread, but synchronized action became rare. Everyone was angry. No one moved. The coordination trap doesn't eliminate dissent. It atomizes it. Each voice becomes a lone signal, easy to ignore, easy to punish. And the data shows a hard threshold. Once enough first movers are discouraged, change probability collapses rapidly. By 2015, documented coordination failures spiked across institutions worldwide. Story 9, the defection penalty. Law, the system punishes first movers. The pattern became undeniable once the data was layered. Across industries, across countries, across decades, the same outcome repeated. The first person to defect paid the highest price. Game theory predicted it. In coordination games, once someone breaks silence, the system must respond quickly or risk collapse. That response is rarely subtle. The warning must be visible. The cost must be memorable. Internal risk models describe this explicitly. The first defector absorbs a penalty large enough to deter imitation. Later defectors often face reduced consequences, sometimes none at all. The message is clear: timing matters more than truth. Whistleblower records confirm it. The earliest reports are dismissed, discredited, or punished. When evidence accumulates and public attention rises, institutions shift posture. Investigations begin. Reforms are announced. But the first mover is already gone. They were early. That was the mistake. This is where Protocol L3B completes its arc. Page 47 of a redacted compliance manual outlines the escalation sequence. Isolate, delay, reframe, neutralize. The language is technical, bloodless, but the outcome is human. Isolation comes first. Access revoked. Meetings canceled. The defector becomes informationally blind. Then delay. Reviews stretch for months. Fatigue sets in. Finally, reframing. The issue is no longer the claim, but the claimant. Their tone, their motives, their fit. The problem moves. Responsibility follows. A senior analyst at a defense contractor reported falsified safety metrics in 2012. He followed protocol, documented everything, expected protection. Instead, he was placed on administrative leave within weeks. Colleagues stopped calling. His security clearance was under review. No charges were filed against him. He missed his mother's funeral while waiting for clearance reinstatement. 2 years later, an external audit confirmed his findings. The company settled quietly. New safeguards were announced. Executives testified about transparency. He was never rehired. Truth arrived late. The penalty arrived early. This asymmetry is not accidental. It stabilizes the game. By punishing first movers harshly, the system teaches everyone else to wait. Delay becomes survival. Silence becomes strategy. By the late 2010s, penalties were automated. Performance flags, reputation scores, algorithmic visibility throttles. No memo required. The defector simply vanished from opportunity streams. No confrontation. No explanation. From the outside, it looked voluntary. From the inside, it felt like exile. The system didn't need to silence everyone. It only needed to silence the first. By 2020, defection penalties were formally integrated into automated risk management systems across major institutions. Story 10. The Invisible Referee. Law. The game persists because no one admits it exists. By the time the last pattern surfaced, it was no longer tied to any single institution. It was structural. The realization came from comparative analysis across decades of behavioral data, different games, different players, identical outcomes. The incentive survived turnover. People changed. The behavior didn't. Game theory had always assumed a referee, some neutral mechanism that enforced rules and balanced outcomes. But in real life, no such figure exists. The referee is distributed, embedded in policy, automated into software, normalized through culture. No one is in charge. And that makes the system harder to confront. The invisible referee operates through incentives alone. Rewards arrive on schedule. Penalties arrive quietly. No explanations required because the rules feel natural. Promotions follow visibility. Silence follows risk. Compliance feels like maturity. The game explains itself. That's the illusion. What makes this final law durable is that it removes intent. No villain is necessary. Each participant enforces a system by responding rationally to incentives. Managers follow policy. Algorithms follow metrics. Individuals follow survival logic. Responsibility dissolves. This is why exposure rarely changes outcomes. When a rule is revealed, it doesn't disappear. It is acknowledged, debated, and then absorbed. Awareness alone does not break a game if the payoffs remain intact. A mid-level administrator described learning about behavioral manipulation models during a compliance seminar. She recognized them immediately in her own workplace. The realization didn't free her. It trapped her. She knew the rules. She also knew violating them would end her career. She stayed. She adapted. She taught new hires how to survive. She stopped correcting the system. The humane loss here was generational. Once incentives are internalized, enforcement no longer requires oversight. People self-regulate. They warn others. They reproduce the game. The referee disappeared. The rules stayed. This is a hinge. The moment where psychology becomes infrastructure, where choice becomes choreography, where freedom exists only within boundaries no one remembers drawing. The 10 laws do not control you individually. They control the environment you act inside. And environments shape behavior more reliably than belief. The final reveal is simple and unsettling. The board was never neutral. And once a game runs long enough, no one remembers agreeing to play.